The troubling relationship between China and Hong Kong is only continued. The New York Times writes, quote, unions have folded, political parties have shut down, independent media outlets and civil rights groups have disappeared. The Hong Kong government, its authority backed fully by Beijing, is shutting down the city's civil society, once the most vibrant in Asia, one organization at a time. As the relationship continues to bypass a 1984 deal, the situation between Hong Kong and China is a scenario that may show the power of the government under Xi Jinping. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the half hour. Today's discussion is going to be on China and Hong Kong. And boy, oh boy, do we have a juicy episode for you. There is a lot of history specifically pertaining to this problem, and a lot of recent events that have unfolded in kind of a surprising way, but at the same time, kind of something that we could have forecasted in the future. There have been extemp questions that have existed in the past, and questions that people have asked of if Britain ever knew that China was going to have like control, would they have actually sold Hong Kong to China? Would this deal actually have persisted? So there's been like a lot of hypothetical questions about the situation that's happened and unfolded, but it's a really big topic nonetheless. And we can't change the actions of the past, but we can see what's going on right now. First and foremost, I want to thank everybody for the support. It's been a tremendous road, and both of us are extremely happy. We're hearing great feedback from everybody. We are super stoked that everybody is very supportive of this. We're trying to set a goal, and it's more of like a YouTube goal of we've had talks about like it'd be cool to get to 100 subscribers by January 1st. Very ambitious goal right now. I think it can happen. I think it really can. And you know what? That means that if you guys share the videos, continuously like, comment on our YouTube channel, and subscribe. That button is red. That means you're not subscribed. You probably should click that button and turn on the notification. That really helps out our channel. And yeah. Anyway, enough advertising out of the way. YuYu, this is a topic that I know particularly interests you, and if I'm not mistaken. And this is a really big problem that's happening right now. It's a lot that's unfolded, especially in the last couple of years.
Yeah, I agree. Hong Kong, China, Taiwan, all those countries, they all have very similar and interesting relationships. Like, for example, off-land versus mainland. There are a lot of tensions between the both of them. I know there's a lot of opinions that my parents hold, being Chinese immigrants, in terms of like how they see Hong Kong protesters and how they should view them, or like whether or not the Chinese government is right to do this and stuff like that. I know my parents are very in the mindset that like Hong Kong and Taiwan are very much part of China and like not separate from China. But obviously we know politically this isn't true, and that has caused a lot of tensions to brew and a lot of opinions to form. So really today's episode is about dissecting that relationship, helping y'all to understand it a little bit better, and then forming opinions, gathering other resources to form more opinions on the issue.
And kind of to continue on that statement here, there is a lot of comments about this and a lot of differing opinions. It's not just a yes or no issue. There's also maybe sometimes is a, like, you shouldn't ever answer maybe, but a maybe is sometimes like a really reasonable answer when discussing these. For like people who watch this for speech and debate, maybe is, you should never take a maybe approach. That's not a very good path. But in reality, some of these questions can be answered with that. The other thing that's kind of important I think that we should note before we even jump into this is let me see if I can make sure I phrase how I want to say this right. This is a very difficult topic right now. That's because there's a lot of tensions. There's a lot of everybody really understands that China is a threat to the U.S. And people who are living in China may see the same thing, right? There's obviously a lot of things that we also don't know, okay? And we can't physically answer. It's just not really possible to turn around and say this is something that we know is happening, because some things, like all governments in the world, there are some things that are just not completely released to the public. And China does happen to be one of them. And it's very difficult to really understand the full context of what's going on. We are giving everything based on what we have read and what we know. We don't understand the full extent of everything because there are some things that are kept secret. And we do definitely know this is a real issue. And YuYu, I think that's probably a good place for you to add if you have anything there.
Yeah, I think just a couple of important things. Like, one, separate the state from the people. Like, I know it's very easy, especially with like COVID, especially with everything that's happened in the past year or two, to be very anti-China and to have like anti-Chinese sentiments, which is like okay, but well, I don't want to say like it's okay. I would just say like it is okay to have those types of opinions as long as you're not actively harming others with those opinions, either physically or like verbally. And also, secondly, to be mindful of using sources that might lean towards like US propaganda-y type media. And what I mean by that is like there are sources out there that are very anti-China, that are very pro-America, and will have a lot of rhetoric painting China as like this big bad state that's out to get everybody, when in reality that might not necessarily be the case. It's just that China operates differently from the United States. Are they globalizing? Probably, but like so is the United States, so is the European Union, and like European countries. They like we are all actively trying to globalize and trying to stay at the top of the world power ranking system. So just be mindful of what you read and be mindful of what you can say that can hurt people and what you can do that can hurt people.
And that's a very good statement to make. This is a very sensitive topic, as we were just saying. There's a lot of things that will be discussed here. I will admit to this now. We're not. Nobody here is saying that it's all anti-China or etc. But we're trying to explain what's going on, and that's just the easiest way to put forth of this kind of topic. And yeah, without any delay, we'll just jump right into it. YuYu does a lot of the historical talking that persists with these issues. And today I kind of want to dive into this a lot more because I think the history of these relations is really important. Now, admittedly, we're not going toward previous Britain rule with Hong Kong, and that is a definite lack that is in this episode. Britain rule is very important to understand kind of where Hong Kong is and really its like focus of why it wants to be a democracy, why it wants to have a little bit of capitalism, why it's autonomous in China, etc. If you want to do further reading on that, I absolutely recommend that you do, because understanding its system does date does date during the Great Britain rule, not during its autonomous part now in China. or what is supposed to be autonomous per se. So before we dive into anything, it is important to understand the history of Hong Kong itself and what exactly is its relationship with China. To note, Hong Kong is a special part of China that can manage itself based on China's adoption of the one party, two systems framework. In essence, Hong Kong works as an entirely separate system. This was established in the 1990s to help integrate Taiwan and Hong Kong with their own political and economic ecosystems. So it's pretty simple. The whole idea of we're going to function under one specific party, but we can have a communist system of governance in this area versus a capitalist system in Hong Kong is the whole idea behind what this deal was. And that's what happened in 1984. There was the establishment of the Sino-British Joint Declaration, which gave China the rights to Hong Kong. There were two things that were supposed to be established in this declaration. The first one is that there should be capitalism and a way of life. So it is supposed to be entirely, at least as close to capitalist as the people of Hong Kong want it to be, and having a way of life that is developed in their mindset. The second one is that it has a high degree of autonomy. Supposed to be autonomous. It's not technically it's a part of China, but it's technically in some ways like you can argue that it's its own country. Okay, that's a really big note to make is sometimes you end up hearing people say that Hong Kong is its own country. It's not a part of China. I want to make it clear that I think if you're going to say that, make sure you back that up completely, because the best way to phrase it is Hong Kong is part of China. It's supposed to be autonomous under the Sino-British Joint Declaration, but it is a part of China. And I think that is something that you might agree with me on. If there's disagreement, she'll note that later. As many of us know, Hong Kong has basically been in a battle of its freedoms. China has eroded the basic freedoms that were established in 1984, and that is, once again, to capitalism and a way of life and a high degree of autonomy. In the book Making Hong Kong China, which is written by author Michael C. Davis, he explains, quote, in 15 years after the handover, there was a series of official initiatives aimed at enhancing Beijing's control in ways that would undermine both the autonomy and the rule of law. There's a couple of examples that we can provide here. In 2003, Hong Kong proposed a national treaty legislation. 2012, China tried to bar schools' curriculum to foster Chinese national identity, which Hong Kong saw as propaganda. And in 2014, Hong Kong could only vote for a chief executive in the city by a Beijing list of approved candidates. So quickly, what happened is this is not necessarily taking away from like the capitalism portion. It is trying to erode a little bit of the way of life that Hong Kong has, but it's certainly going against the high degree of autonomy. Trying to bar schools' curriculum to foster Chinese national identity is definitely not making it autonomous. It's definitely making it look like it's under complete, like it's not two separate systems. It's beginning to look like it's one system in general. This basically led to, after the 2014 issue where Hong Kong basically only could vote for a chief executive by a Beijing list of approved candidates, it led to the 2014 protests that are called the Umbrella Movement, which led hope that Hong Kong would become a true democracy. So there was a lot of hope for Hong Kong to move into its own democratic system, as it was really wanting to be in the beginning. But we're not going to dive too much into 2014. What's really memorable now is the Hong Kong protest of 2019. This was both you and I were in Extemp at this time. This was a major topic at the time. And there was probably like 6 weeks straight where I just got questions on it, and it's just ridiculous. Like there's a lot of things that are very important um, about this. It's the biggest explanation for what's going on now. These were the largest protests in Hong Kong's history. Protesters thought that Beijing had done too much to violate their freedoms, and it's basically a bunch of protests that show that the Sino-British Joint Declaration did not or is not being done in the way that it's supposed to be done. A political science professor from the University of Notre Dame named Victoria Tinbor Hui notes, either we stop it now or it's just basically going to be hell. That's the honest to God statement. You either stop what Beijing is doing to control Hong Kong, or they're going to just continue to push and push and push until at one point in time, China is going to just give up. Okay. You can interpret that in many different ways, but that's one example of a good interpretation. These protests continued with firing of tear gas and rubber bullets up until the 2020 COVID-19 pandemic that broke out. And that basically completely stopped these protests. However, in the midst of a pandemic, Beijing passed a national security law. You're going to hear a lot more about this from YuYu here in a few minutes, on Hong Kong, which is an important part to the current status of Hong Kong-China relations. The Council of Foreign Relations explains, quote, Beijing took its most assertive action yet on June 30th of 2020, when it bypassed the Hong Kong legislature and imposed a new national security law on the city. The legislation effectively criminalizes any dissent and adopts extremely broad definitions for crimes such as terrorism, subversion, secession, and collusion with foreign powers. It also allows Beijing to establish a security force in Hong Kong and influence the selection of judges who will hear national security cases. Pro-democracy activists and lawmakers decried the move and expressed fear that it could be the end of Hong Kong. Meanwhile, Chinese officials and pro-Beijing lawmakers said it was necessary to restore stability following the massive protests. Authorities have used the law to try to eliminate all forms of political opposition. They disqualified pro-democracy candidates from running in the 2020 legislative elections, which were ultimately postponed, and removed elected lawmakers for publicly opposing China's control over Hong Kong. In addition, police have arrested dozens of Hong Kong's most prominent pro-democracy activists and former lawmakers, and the government has started to prosecute them. These moves have silenced many Hong Kong residents who had fought for democracy and prompted others to flee the city. The Hong Kong government's efforts to transform the public education system by introducing so-called patriotic programs have also troubled many parents and students. End quote. Yes, that's the whole thing. Okay. There's a lot there. And this national security law has done quite a bit to basically say that Hong Kong is, the easiest way to put it is exactly how the pro-democracy activists are explaining. It's looking like the end of Hong Kong. It looks like it's going to be no longer a one party, two systems. It's going to be a one party, one system. The response to Beijing's actions has not been completely unanimous, however. Obviously, the United States, United Kingdom, Australia, Canada, and New Zealand have all voiced concerns on the laws that China has passed. There's a crackdown going on the Chinese government through Hong Kong. And basically, if you are noting this, this is a global effort for Western democracies. Now, we can talk a lot about Western democracy in this region. There's been, specifically in this region, there's been a massive Westernization, which may look like an explanation as to why China may be trying to get some control with Hong Kong. is everything has become so westernized around them that it's beginning to seem like there is a fear that their system is going to become lackluster, for lack of a better term. Yet countries that are a part of the Belt and Road Initiative in China have expressed that the national security law for Hong Kong is good. Now, maybe this is not true. Okay, maybe these countries that are part of this initiative don't actually see this as good, but they're expressing it because there's going to be a load of economic benefits for the 53 countries that are part of this initiative. And YuYu, kind of to draw right from there, that's kind of the big concern here is we have a lot of democracies, especially Western Hemisphere democracies, that are in this region and making a noise in essence. We can talk all day about westernized societies going from South Korea. We can talk about Japan. We can talk about so on and so forth. All of these different regions are westernized, and it kind of makes there a threat for Hong Kong democracy in essence.
Yeah, I would like generally say so. I feel like the narrative that we all know is like Western versus Eastern, and the narrative that China definitely knows is like Westernization has been a big part of the East in terms of like countries like Japan and the Koreas and stuff like that. And very much so because of the complicated relationship between China and the West, they have tended to try to avoid Westernization and kind of do their own thing. And so this whole situation between China and Hong Kong, of course, also brings tensions between China and Western countries. And to kind of get more into that, I'm sorry if I like pause and like cough. I've been sick all week. So side note on that. But keeping kind of my part of this episode fairly shorter because Spencer has done a good job and has covered the majority of the situation and the history behind China and Hong Kong and its relationship with other countries. But more specifically, I want to talk about like what has happened recently that we decided this was a good topic to cover for the season, and what exactly have other countries done in response to what's happening. So like Spencer said, the main thing that has happened so far is the national security law that Beijing had passed. But recently, like in October, there is this new censorship law that Hong Kong's legislature has passed. So working with mainland China, the censorship law bans any films or any social media that could potentially hurt China's national security interests. As you can imagine, many people were outraged and protested against this law, mainly like your film producers and stuff like that have protested against this law, saying that it is a violation of like their rights and their like art and creativity. But other than that, another recently big thing that has happened is that a Hong Kong man known as Captain America, he is very big during like rallies and protests in Hong Kong. He was sentenced to more than 5 years in jail for chanting slogans and promoting Hong Kong's independence from China. He is the man that holds the superhero shield at protest rallies, kind of like demonstrating the protection, but now he's been arrested. All of these events are kind of an indicator that China is going to continue to crack down on its citizens and work to integrate Hong Kong into China. From the beginning, I believe this was the goal. China had lost Hong Kong during the Opium Wars and then got it back eventually later. While they did make the agreement, the plan was to always just integrate Hong Kong back to China. And that's what we've been seeing China do with both Hong Kong and with Taiwan. But what has been the international response to this? Well, President Biden has sided with the protesters in Hong Kong and wants to work with China to come up with a peaceful solution or to come up with some type of agreement. This is very similar to what's been going on and what has been talked about when they have addressed Taiwan and Chinese relations, which Biden has also voiced concern over. While there have been only talks between Biden and Xi Jinping over the phone, there has also recently been a virtual summit between them to formally discuss resolutions to this problem. However, no joint statement was known to be released after the virtual summit. Mainly, however, like any president, even former President Trump, Biden will probably focus more on like trade relations with China and maintaining those ties, more so Biden wanting to maintain those ties as best as he can. But he also has to keep in mind of the laws that the US has passed in recent years. For example, in 2019, they passed the Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act, which necessitates that the US help Hong Kong citizens gain more democracy and gain freedom from China, and also having the ability for Hong Kong citizens to kind of immigrate to the United States and get visas and green cards that way. But other than that, the US, along with Canada, New Zealand, Australia, and others, like Spencer said, have suspended their extradition treaties due to the national security law in Hong Kong. And what this means is that if a Hong Kong citizen has fled to one of those countries to get away from prosecution from Hong Kong or from China, they're safe in the event that China or Hong Kong wants to ask for the prisoner back or ask the country to give that prisoner back. The UK has also granted 3 million citizens to move to and apply for citizenship in the United Kingdom. Canada has also made similar moves, creating easier pathways towards permanent residency in Canada for Hong Kong citizens. And also, generally, the European Union has expressed grave concerns over the law and has limited exports on items that helps China's repression tactics and has promised to make the visa process less strict, like the United States and the United States and Hong Kong Democracy and Freedom Act. It's a very long name. But anyway, the most interesting part is that the majority of UN countries are not in or has shown opposition to China, like Spencer said. 53 countries supported the national security bill, and only 27 countries has shown opposition to it or criticized it. Like, again, keep in mind that the 53 countries have signed on to, or the majority of them have signed on to China's One Road, One Belt initiative, which I think gives China leverage over those countries. And I think you'll find many news sources say that this gives China leverage over those countries in agreeing with Chinese law. But besides international international relations and circle in the international community, we also have to focus on how it's affecting Hong Kong. And besides limiting their rights and also the repression tactics that have been used and harmed civilians and even killed some civilians, we also have to kind of take a look at the bigger picture on how it's affecting Hong Kong generally. Many people are afraid that they're going to lose their culture due to the crackdown and the national security law. It's also affecting Hong Kong's economy just a tad bit. Okay, maybe more than a tad bit, but we will see as things kind of move forward. Generally, companies have wanted to move out to other Asian countries like Singapore or Japan, specifically in Tokyo. Social media companies are in extreme opposition to this national security law because they have to give up user data. And it's kind of in the terms and agreement that they won't do that technically, but they would have to under the national security law. And TikTok has also suspended their activities in Hong Kong for the time being too, which is also another interesting thing because we know TikTok, ByteDance, they come from China, and suspending those activities in Hong Kong is like an indicator that this is affecting more than just those two countries. But like always, we have no idea what's going to happen next. But people are very scared that this tension could turn into a lot more than just what it is now. It could potentially maybe turn into a war or trigger a war. Let's hope that doesn't happen. There are things out there that indicates this won't happen generally. But also keep in mind that this isn't just going on in Hong Kong. It's also going on in Taiwan and other off-land countries near China that China has taken claim to. And this is just one example of what's going on in terms of Chinese relations with other countries that are surrounding China.
And to jump on the aspect of like could trigger war. Some people even argue that we're in the midst of a new Cold War, um, because the tensions between the United States and China are pretty much similar to, in a lot of ways, tensions between the United States and the USSR, but arguably in this instance, it's not as much of nuclear weapons as it is economic expansion. And that really brings into a lot about this week's questions. Now, we did do a lot of talking about China and Hong Kong. These questions are more of examining what the state of China has done. Okay. And is and we will be making like those connections back to Hong Kong, and we'll explain kind of how it drives kind of like the purpose here. But each of these questions are more revolving around changes that happened in China. Okay. And just to open it up, the first question is Xi Jinping's cultural revolution working? Very simple question. We'll start with YuYu and we'll go from there.
I really don't know if that's a good idea because while I do have like Asian roots, like Chinese roots, especially with my parents, what I know about kind of like the cultural revolution that is going on is not necessarily painted in like the best light. And I also generally just don't know too much about the cultural revolution that Xi Jinping has started to like implement in China, or like has already implemented in China, and where he's going forward with that. But in terms of like, is the cultural revolution working just bare bones? I would say like generally yes, because he has been pretty successful with what he has implemented and how he has implemented that. For example, we're seeing more integration of Hong Kong into China's mainland and more integration of the two cultures, even though they do have their differences. And we're also seeing that with Taiwan too, where the laws between that and like the relation between that is trying to integrate Taiwan more into China as well. And the type of culture that he's basically spurring is this new age type of thing where it is okay, it's like a little complicated because it's a bit of combination of what has happened in the past, but also trying to implement some types of like liberal democracy in the process too, without actually giving a lot of power to the people. And I know that makes like no sense whatsoever, but it's generally what has been happening for China. Like they have been trying to move towards this kind of liberal democracy, but at the same time, not fully democracy, because it's not like they are like implementing statewide censuses to get people's opinions, or like they have votes and stuff to like have this type of like conversation between the government and the people. It's mainly like the government is doing what is best for the people, and if it shows results, then that's what they go with. And like that's kind of like what has been going on politically.
With you saying that was basically bare bones, that's basically what it is. This is the best description I have found of the Cultural Revolution. Basically, the Chinese Communist Party has noted that Xi Jinping is in the top of the country's most successful leaders. And the idea of the Cultural Revolution is that China has reformed its political, economic, social, foreign policy, etc. So it's more of like not just a cultural integration. It's really looking at like how it's been able to fix its economic system, why China has seen a massive amount of economic success, why its social framework is maybe becoming a lot better. Its foreign policy has been a lot more strict. And you can look at a lot of this, and part of this obviously includes internal control of the state. You can look at Hong Kong, you can look at Xinjiang, you can look at et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? And kind of to note, the Chinese Communist Party has noted that Xi Jinping is with this cultural revolution is in the top of the country's most successful leaders and legitimately has put a statue of him next to Mao Zedong, right? Which is a very big achievement in China. Um, but to answer this question in both yes and no, okay, I think the answer that most people are going to take is yes. And that sounds kind of insane, considering that there's a lot of internal control of democracies and protests that are happening within China. But hear me out on this, okay? This is how we know a state is successful. Is a state is definitionally speaking, political scientists most of the time use a definition by Max Weber to define a state as a country that's able to control its own citizens. And that sounds very harsh, but that is exactly what a definition, that's exactly the definition that is often used. Kind of a scary definition because it's like turning around saying if you're able to control your own people, then you are a strong state. Oftentimes, democracies are viewed as weak states because people are protesting in the streets more often. There's a lot more liability or a lot more leverage of what people can and can't do. And having a lot of internal control means that you are a strong state, which means that you are effective at controlling your population. Call it strange, that's how it's defined. Okay? Obviously, there's a difference between the strong state and the autonomous region, etc. But if we look at it from that perspective, is the Cultural Revolution working? Absolutely. It is definitely showing that China is gaining power. As a matter of fact, we know China to be in competition with the United States as a global power. Bear in mind that there can only ever bear in mind that we oftentimes throw out the word hegemony, but hegemony is only one. Okay? There can only be one that's like ever at the top. You can't have two that are at the same time. You can't just have China and the United States. A lot of people argue that United States is still the global hegemon, but China is working its power up to it. And that shows that a cultural revolution is becoming successful. People can argue no to this by turning around and saying, hey, these protests show signs that there's not complete control. Okay. Hong Kong's protests are showing that there is some weakness that is with the Chinese Communist Party's rule. And they are trying to expose that of China, and China is not doing a very good job of being able to control its own people. But if we really look at this from a basic perspective and just looking at the national security law that was passed in 2020, is China really controlling its own people and doing a good job of it? Yes. And I think generally speaking, when we really look at like how this cultural revolution has taken place, yeah, it's undeniable. This is a very successful revolution. It's gaining China a lot of power.
Yeah, and I think just some like political history behind it, because I am taking like a Chinese political thought class, and we're moving closer and closer to the timeline of current events of Xi Jinping and stuff like that. An interesting thing to know is that nobody thought Xi Jinping was actually going to have this much power or be this like powerful leader to begin with, especially when he started off his like political career. And it was a shock to many of like the main scholars and the main political theorists at the time that like Xi Jinping did gain that much power and that much thought. But generally the trend of like Chinese political thought has moved towards more state control, like more government control, more government deciding what's good for the people, and that type of like democratic sense. And generally, they have been like pretty successful with getting people on track, or at least making people happy, because despite hearing news about like Hong Kong, despite hearing news about like Taiwan, it seems that generally the majority of people on mainland China do support Xi Jinping and do support the government of China, because there's like nothing else, or like there's not really anything else to compare it to, and they're like living a decent life generally. And that is where you get disparities between like Chinese mainland, or like Chinese people on the mainland, and then Chinese people who are not on the mainland. And I know there's just this like tension, I guess, between my parents and their old friends that are on the mainland politically, about how like, oh, you're not like a real Chinese person if you like moved to America, especially, and stuff like that. So that is just like all indicators that it is working to integrate the citizens into kind of this new culture, this new type of movement, this new like pro-China sentiment. But that moves on us to like the second question, if you don't have anything else to add.
No, I was just going to mention once again, there's nobody here is kind of drawing back to what we said at the beginning. Nobody here is going to turn around and say that we're anti-China, right? Once again, the purpose of this is to push our political beliefs aside, etc. And this is a very good example of it. China's government's working; they're successful.
Yeah. But yeah, the second question that we have is, will cultural crackdowns help or hinder the power of China's Communist Party? And then we can have Spencer start off on this one.
In a nutshell, this is the same question as the first one reworded. And that's super honest. Because this is, instead though, rather than this being a cultural revolution, it says cultural crackdowns. The cultural crackdown in essence is literally the same thing. It's really them just trying to revise this. But now the question is really, is this helping the Chinese Communist Party? Okay. And that becomes a very different question, rather than politically for Xi Jinping, this has been something that's worked for him. So in comparison, it can work for Xi Jinping, but it doesn't necessarily work for the party, right? You think of it like a political system, something that could be very good for Democrats in the United States could be very bad for Joe Biden, right? Something that could, we're seeing a lot of that right now in the US. And US is maybe not a very good comparison here, but we see a lot of that with the US with Republicans and Donald Trump, right? We see a lot of things that Republicans want to do as maybe this is actually a good idea, but we still view some of the things that Donald Trump did as not very great, right? So remember that there can be a separation here. Something can be successful with Xi Jinping, but not very good for the entire party. Okay. Nonetheless, I think that this is good for the party. Again, I think that that's a pretty fair statement to make, especially after we listed all of the advantages of what just happened. This certainly is going to help them. As you say, there's a lot of support from the mainland China. Just looking at that in general, you got to understand that a lot of people are happy with where they live. Okay? They're happy with the way the government has been going. Admittedly, one of the things I've heard is that China is going to do like a survey on what people think about Bitcoin being banned and do like a public poll, right? Not to throw Bitcoin in here, but there's evidence of like they're going to try and like do a public opinion poll, right? Now, what does that mean? We don't actually know. Okay, and that's being completely honest. But what we do know is that the this has been a very successful transition, and this has been a very good thing for the party politically in mainland China. I want to give a secondary answer, of course. That's the purpose. Here's how you could answer hinder. I think the best way to answer for this one, because you got to remember, this is a party, this is not a specific person. Okay. I think the best way you can answer hinder is with the international argument, and turning around and saying that these countries are going against what China's doing, right? You can talk about the United States, United Kingdom, etc. Everything that they're expressing their concern with what's going on with China, right? They can bring this up to the United Nations. They can bring this up in global summits. They can do a lot. And that's a really big problem, right? And in a lot of ways, international pressure can sometimes lead to parties not having a good outlook. And that's just an honest statement, right? Like we can expect, right, that the United States, one of the things the United States did under President Trump was pull out of the Paris Climate Accord. Okay? We got a lot of international backlash for it. Okay, and while it's a far stretch to say that's the explanation as to why Biden won in 2020, it's a very good indication of how international pressure can lead the United States to having differing opinions on parties that are in power. And that's something that is really worth noting, is that international pressure can cause distress in the Chinese Communist Party. This cultural crackdown by major Western democracies could, in theory, give a very different perspective and make that available to the citizens of China, right? And say, maybe this is a real problem, maybe this is something that is important. Nonetheless, I do think that the Communist Party here is doing the cultural crackdowns are helping them. It's important to explain that. But nonetheless, the way that you would answer hinder to this one is, I think international pressure really makes it hard on the Communist Party.
I think this is where I disagree a little bit with Spencer in terms of help or hinder. Just because I think the nature of the question is a little bit different than is the Cultural Revolution working? You can say the Cultural Revolution is working for the majority of Chinese citizens because the majority of Chinese citizens are very appreciative of the government and do support them. However, in terms of cultural crackdowns, in terms of helping or hindering the power of the Chinese Communist Party, that to me sounds like whether it is legitimizing or delegitimizing the power of the Chinese Communist Party. And in terms of their cultural crackdowns, you can make the argument of hinder because it is sort of delegitimizing the Chinese Communist Party in the eyes of Hong Kong, in the eyes of Taiwan, and especially in the eyes of the international community, who are pretty big world powers like the United States and the European Union as a whole. I know they're not one country, but they're they still generally have power collectively among them. So it is a good thing to note that when you do have these type of cultural crackdowns and you have protests arise with because of these cultural crackdowns, for example, in Hong Kong, it garners a lot of international reactions to that problem. And when they do that, it shows that kind of the international community is undermining China's own political leadership on their own country, is what it looks like in China's eyes. And you can make the argument that because they have cracked down on Hong Kong and Hong Kong is not very receptive of this, doesn't really want China there, especially its citizens. They don't want China there and they're trying to get out. It is delegitimizing the rule of the Chinese Communist Party, seeing China more as kind of a authoritarian-ish type state, trying to control every single one of its citizens rather than like a legitimate democracy or like a legitimate government that people do support, if that makes sense. But that would be how like Taiwan, how Hong Kong kind of ties into this. I do agree with tying in like the international aspect of it, like tying in the United States sentiment towards that kind of relationship, and also tying in like the UK, the European Union, and even like the UN, even though like the minority of countries have spoken in opposition to the national security law. But all those type of actions signal that you are delegitimizing the rule of China, or like undermining it just a little bit, hindering it a little bit, and showing that like maybe this isn't the way to go. Maybe there's like another path to go.
Let's throw a radical argument out there. You could argue that international pressure may actually cause a hindrance, but the best way through international pressure for China is going to probably be through the UN. Okay, and I think that that is something that you would probably agree with me on. I don't know entirely, but here's why. Here's why the UN is not a good option in this instance. International pressure is best conveyed with going through and actually having like an investigation from like the United Nations, etc. But the United Nations gets everything approved for debate by first it has to have a unanimous vote by all 5 of its biggest countries that are deemed, and one of them is China. So international pressure is completely negated. And it is something that is kind of important to understand. That means if there really wants to be international pressure against China, then in some way, shape, or form, globalization has to stop toward China. Okay, because you can't really use the UN, but China's a great place for globalization, and a lot of countries recognize that. So kind of just looking at this kind of this point of view, right? If when China is one of the 5 voices that can speak at the United Nations about whether something can be investigated or not, I believe this is the Security Council, if I remember correctly. I don't remember my entire UN stuff. Okay. But the fact that they're one of the 5 voices that can turn around and say no, hey, and it has to be a unanimous decision, and China says no, because China doesn't want doesn't want the UN to investigate what's going on in their own country, there's no real point of hindrance. Because that continues to give China's Communist Party complete control, because their representative, their ambassador to the UN is going to say, no, we don't want to do this.
But like also keep in mind that not everything happens through the UN. Like international relation wise, there's a lot going on behind the scenes that don't deal with the UN at all. Like for example, the United States uses a lot of its soft power and uses a lot of its hard power too against nations who don't necessarily like go through the UN or like follow UN decisions, or don't even support UN decisions. And other than that, like negotiations between China, United States passing domestic laws that deal with international relations also factors in how they deal with situations and how they kind of deem each other as like legitimate governments. Keep in mind, globalization is also happening, and like they are both world powers that want to kind of fight for control of, you know, globalization and their power and their stance in the world. So they both have been creating a lot of tensions due to this, and that is where tensions mainly arise from. But I feel like domestically, if there is a hindrance in the place that you are trying to kind of extend your control to, then it does like hinder the power of the Chinese Communist Party to an extent, because they can't necessarily like have a full grasp of Hong Kong or have a full grasp of Taiwan just yet, especially if they if there are like world powers in the international community backing them up. So that's kind of where my answer comes from.
I think that's a great place to actually wrap it up, because there's a lot of debate on this, and I honestly think that, to be completely honest with most of our viewers, this is a very good topic for you to research with a lot of the stuff that we've linked down there, down below. And honestly, the debate can go for days. There are, when we give answers for help or hinder, we are giving so, like, we're given, we've basically given you like 3 or 4 different answers, right? But there's probably 40 or 50 or more, right, to whether or not this is helping and or hindering. And once again, probably a good area that we can probably say maybe it's doing both. Maybe it's actually going neutral, right? But unfortunately, with this question, we can't answer it, right? We can't answer that way. But I think that's a great place for us to wrap up.
But we really appreciate everybody that has been listening to our podcast and sharing support so far. We love each and every single one of you. Please be on the lookout for polls on either of our Instagrams talking about which topic we should do next. Usually we reach out to like an exclusive number of people before deciding and dwindling down to the last 2 topics that we would discuss, and then posting those polls on our Instagram. If you have any comments, questions, or concern, feel free to DM either me or Spencer, or email us, or contact us in any way or shape you can. Subscribe to the channel, ring the bell, share this with your friends, share this with your family if they are interested in current events and news. And like always, let us know how you did. Let us know how we're doing. Get the 1 in the round. If you don't get the 1 in the round, still let us know. We appreciate you. We love you. Until next time. Bye.